Hangout is all right. We're going to assume that's working and get down to business. Good evening to everyone. It's nice to see so many people who wanted to come and learn a little Mishnah. But to start for tonight, I just wanted to do a brief introduction of what Mishnah is. So for those of you that are here, I'm going to be giving you a handout of the text that we're using today and additional handouts later, but you are welcome to bring your own copy. For those of you that are playing at home or who want to read ahead at home, there's a wonderful website called sefaria.org, sefaria.org, which has an amazing collection of Jewish texts. And in particular for this class, they have the Mishnah, and they have the Mishnah both in Hebrew and English, which is very, very helpful, I know, for many students. However, the main text that we're going to be using, that I will provide, comes from the USCJ, United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. For many, many years, one of the little-known benefits of USCJ is they have been providing, through the email, daily Mishnah chapters. It's Mishnah Yomit. You can study a little bit of Mishnah every day, and it comes to you through the email. And I have taken their translation with notes and compiled them to be our text for this class. So we'll be using their translation, and their commentary will also be on the page. Sound good? Okay, so let me erase this now that we know how to find the text and talk about what the Mishnah itself is. Who here knows how to drive a car? I got a number of hands up in the room. Good, because I thought I saw you all driving up, and I just want to make sure. Who here learned how to drive a car from the manual they give you in driver's ed class? No? You didn't. The manual in driver's ed class didn't teach you. If you were given the manual in driver's ed class and you read it cover to cover all by yourself, and then you walked out to the parking lot and someone handed you keys, how far do you think you'd get before you had an accident? Do you think you'd make it out of the parking lot? Down through the first traffic light? Onto the freeway? In the rain? Might be a little hard. How do you learn how to drive a car? By doing it.
As a person teaching you.
With someone teaching you. Right? And when the person's teaching you, are they contradicting what's in the book? Are they saying things different than what's in the book? Sometimes I know that's modern, people for you. But usually they are explaining, clarifying, amplifying upon what's in the book, giving more examples, more information, more rulings that can help you do it. And they're watching you do it so that you understand what the book is talking about and how it applies to real life. In short, that's Mishnah. In short, that's what we call the oral Torah. And according to the Mishnah itself, according to Judaism, when God gave Torah to the people of Israel, when God gave us the Torah, God also sat us down in the driver's seat and walked us through how to do all of the things the Torah talks about. Right? So he gave us the written version, and then he also gave us the oral explanation. So we have a written Torah, and we have the oral Torah. Now, the oral Torah wasn't written down for centuries. It was taught teacher to student, through the generations. And it was taught that way for exactly the same reason that you don't learn best how to drive by just reading the book. You learn best by having a teacher, because the teacher, hopefully, who sat with you in the car and taught you how to drive, knew how to phrase things so you would understand it best, knew how to explain things so you would understand it best. They didn't change the rules. They didn't say the speed limit can be what you want it to be, but they explained why the speed limit is 55 in a way you could come to grips with. That was the oral Torah for many, many, many hundreds of years, more than 1,000 years. It was explained teacher to student in an adaptive mode, still in the core in agreement, but adapting teacher to student in the relationship as needed. Make sense? Maybe? A little bit? You're following me so far? All right, along comes the 2nd century of the Common Era, and things are getting shaky. there has been huge disruptions caused by factionalism within Judaism and caused by the external pressures of the Roman occupation and oppression. And the chains of tradition have become muddied. They're not clear. It's almost like somebody said it was 55 and someone else said it was 50. And it came time to clarify what the oral teaching really was. And the Mishnah we have now is the written record of what was considered to be the best copy of that oral explanation that could then be reprinted and carried no matter where we would end up without fear of losing at least the core of that oral explanation. There's one drawback, which is this can't teach you all by itself. This can't adapt to every student the way a human teacher can. And so very quickly, that became the launching point for study, but you still needed a human teacher. But at least all the teachers were drawing from that same core text for their oral explanation of the same written text. Probably best if I have it right side up. Okay, so we're following that idea? Right, so the Mishnah is the record of the clearest, and you may debate that after we've studied for a while, but trust me, it could have been worse, the clearest record of the oral explanation that was passed generation to generation of how to understand and apply the Torah in actual practice. Clear? Maybe? Right, so when it comes down to it, just studying the Torah isn't enough to know how to be a Jew. Right? You just give someone a Torah, and it's the equivalent of just giving someone a book about driving, which is they'll get a lot of things right, but ask them to get behind the wheel of a car and you're asking for an accident. Ask someone to live a life having just read the Torah all by themselves, and they will come to, let's be diplomatic, they will come to mistaken conclusions, which will lead to mistakes in their life. And the Mishnah, with study, is meant to prevent that. Make sense? All right.
One of the examples that I have had is one of our commandments is observe Shabbat. It doesn't tell you how. What do you look at? I mean, how do you observe it? I don't know. What do you do next?
Yeah. Observe Shabbat, keep Shabbat, remember Shabbat. Are these different things or are they the same things? Don't work on Shabbat, right? The Torah doesn't give us explicit lists, right? Slaughter an animal according to the way that I've told you, and yet the Torah doesn't actually tell us in its own written text how to do the slaughter. So the Mishnah is there because, of course, God explained these things, and of course, those explanations were carried on. There's another element of Mishnah, but we're gonna get some example in so that we can talk about some other features of how Mishnah works. Now, we're going to mainly draw from the English. When necessary, I'll make reference to the Hebrew, but for brevity's sake as well as accessibility, we're going to focus on the English translation. If you have your own translation that you've brought, and I see a couple, or at least one floating around the room, please feel free to chime in if you feel your translation has a significant variation. Okay? Good. Now, who would like to save my voice? That is to say, who would like to read on my behalf?
Is this from the introduction?
Well, we're not going to read on each page. Thank you. I guess I should have explained that first. On each page from the USCJ, United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, there is an introduction to that chapter and that Mishnah. We reference Mishnayot. We reference each piece of Mishnah by its chapter and which paragraph, essentially, it is in that chapter. So you say chapter 1, Mishnah 1, chapter 2, Mishnah 2, chapter 2, Mishnah 5. So you'll see as we go through. So it's you're going to get two numbers to know what Mishnah we're dealing with. And we're only dealing with chapter 1 tonight, and we'll see how far we get. So it's chapter 1, Mishnah 1. There's a brief introduction about the topic. Then there is the actual Mishnah text. That's the one that's labeled Mishnah 1. And then underneath are commentary from United Synagogue about that Mishnah. But I'm only asking you to commit to reading the Mishnah text where it says Mishnah 1.
Mishnah 1. From what time may one recite the Shema in the evening?
Okay, so here's one of those questions that we talked about. The Torah says you will recite these words, right? Sound familiar? Ve'ahavta, right? After the Shema, it says you will recite these words when you lie down and when you rise up. And so what does that mean? Right? When is that time period for reciting them? If I'm supposed to recite them when I'm lying down and when I'm rising up, give me my window, right? Or does that mean literally just when I'm rising up and just when I'm lying down? So that's our first question. From what time does it qualify as fulfilling that commandment of reciting the words for lying down in the evening? What time or period are we talking about? Right?
I would assume when you're going to bed.
Okay. Well, actually, let's go ahead and take a few guesses here, right? So it could be bed. And I'm guessing you mean my bed. When I go to bed,
Yes.
I should say the Shema.
Yes.
Right. So what happens if you work the graveyard shift and you go to bed at 1 o'clock in the afternoon so you can wake up at 8 p.m. in order to go to work?
It just says when I lie down.
It's okay. So we might really want to emphasize the my of when you lie down. And if we did, then we would think that when I'm lying down for my sleep, that's when I should recite the Shema, and that may be completely different from anyone else. Okay? Any other alternatives of when the evening Shema should be recited? Well, how about if we take out the my and we just say
Oh,
bedtime.
Oh.
Right? And bedtime is a window. There's a certain time window when most people are going to bed.
Yes, I go to bed at 2 a.m.
Okay?
I'm awake at night, so I go to sleep 2 a.m.
But if we were to take a survey and ask for the average bedtime
Oh,
in the pre-industrial world where you didn't have artificial lighting, right? Most people are going to go to bed, give or take an average day length, probably maybe an hour after sunset, maybe a little bit earlier, right? And then some people might stay up a bit later if they need to, and oil lamps and torches and whatnot. And you can have a window, but it's going to be in the early part of the evening, maybe.
and it's going to vary with the seasons.
Right. Or maybe evening just means night. Maybe as long as the sun ain't up, it's evening, and that's okay. See how if we were left to our own deductive reasoning skills, everyone in the room might come to a different conclusion. And that doesn't really help the cohesiveness of our faith. And so we are very thankful that we have a tradition that explains it, as we'll see, with a little variation.
Because if we all did it at our own time, when would we be able to have morning minyan
Mhm.
and evening minyan? If we would not have community, if that's what you're saying.
Not at all.
Number one, from the time that the priests enter their houses in order to eat their terumah until the end of the first watch. That's the words of Rabbi Eliezer.
Okay, so that's all nice and clear. We can go home.
Yes, that's right.
So Rabbi Eliezer answers the question, not with another question, but with a bit of information that demands us to get some more explanation. So he says, well, we say the Shema at the same time that the priests who had been ritually impure and then have gone to mikvah and have to wait a certain amount of time, when they would now be eligible to go into their house and eat truma, for which they must be ritually pure, then that begins the window of time that we can we can recite the Shema. Right? So he's trying to peg the time of the Shema to another time that was ritually significant that is mentioned in the Torah. And he's saying that's the beginning of the time, from when the priests go in to eat. Now, we have a name for that time in the modern world, and we call that Seit Kochavim, the coming out of 3 stars. Right? So that gets explained in other parts, but that's what he's referencing here, which is when there are 3 stars in the sky, that's when the evening really has begun. Because that's when the priests would have gone in to eat to be able to then be able to eat their truma. Make sense? Okay. The words of Rabbi Eliezer. But,
the sages say until midnight.
all right. Welcome to Mishnah. Are the sages arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? Yes? But what are they arguing about?
Timing.
The timing, but which part of the timing? You got to read carefully here.
The finish.
The finish, okay? So notice, Rabbi Eliezer says it's from the time when the priest would go in to eat truma from 3 stars until, he says, first watch, right? The night would have been divided into 3 watches in the ancient world. You had the first watch, you had the middle watch, and then you had the last watch, which was that which finished at dawn. And he's saying the end of that first watch, that's when most people, that's bedtime, that's usual for sleep, that's your window to do it. The sages say, no, you've got until midnight, right? The end of the first watch. That's when we're finishing. Are they arguing about the start? No. So it's very subtle, and this is what can make Mishnah confusing, is you have to figure out what it is that they're arguing about in order to understand the argument, and they don't tell you. Very often they don't tell you. It's just implied by the word order and the structure of the text.
First watch, timing-wise, is at 9 p.m.?
Well, it depends on the length of the day,
Yeah.
right? So the nighttime would be divided into 3 sections, and the first third of that would be the first watch. But midnight would have happened in the middle of the second watch. Right, because you have the third and then the middle third, the middle of which is midnight, and then you have the last third, which is the morning. So it's not exactly drawn to scale, but that's kind of the idea there. So it's a little bit later, not a huge amount later, but a little bit later. And then one more comment.
Rabbi Gamliel says until dawn.
What's he arguing about? The end again. Exactly. He's saying no, it goes all the way to dawn. Is he arguing about the start? No argument about the start. So we have consensus. This is good. We have consensus about the start, right? Which is that it is the time the priests go into eat truma, what we call Seit Kochavim, the 3 stars appearing in the sky. Excellent. What we seem to have is disagreement about when you finish your window of opportunity for fulfilling the mitzvah of reciting the evening Shema. And we have 3 different times that are being mentioned. Okay, this is probably a good place to pause and have you ask me the obvious question. They're arguing. Didn't I say this was the oral explanation that was given by God from with the giving of the Torah, and that it was passed teacher to student, and that although there may have been variation and explanation and style of teaching, the core rules didn't change teacher to student. What are we doing with an argument? Right? How do we end up with an argument if we started with one explanation?
Does this have anything to do with the fact that the temple was destroyed, so you really might not know anymore when the priests were entering to do the truma?
It has to do with the Reisha, but not the Sefer. That is to say, it has to do with the beginning of what you said, but it doesn't have anything to do with the end of what you said.
Okay.
So does it have to do with the destruction that we had undergone? Yes. Does it have to do with the destruction because we can't go watch them? No. But with the destruction, and even prior to that, with the inadequacy of the disciples of Hillel and Shammai, as well as earlier disruptions among our people during the Babylonian period, etc., the tradition became clouded on certain matters. The basic understanding is the same. Look, we all agree on when we're supposed to start. And as we're going to see, even the end time is not as controversial as it sounds. But some of the finer points did become slightly murky. And part of the Mishnah's job is to tell you the minority opinions that were rejected in favor of what was considered to be the authentic tradition. Now, this is very much like if you are paying attention to summer politics, very much like Supreme Court decisions, right? You have the agreement of the majority, and then you have a dissenting opinion. The difference, of course, is that with regards to Mishnah, the dissenting opinions are not held onto tenaciously by their followers as something that should be clung to and adhered to and observed, but are instead said, look, this was a dissenting opinion, and we said it was wrong, so you can forget that. Know why they said it, know why it's wrong, and now know what's right. So it's there by way of illustration and explanation, and so that no one later will come and say, but you didn't understand you never heard what Rabbi Eliezer said. And you say, no, I know what Rabbi Eliezer said. I've got it in my Mishnah, and he gets overruled, right? So that way it can't come as a counter argument because it's already there, unknown, and rejected. Make sense? Maybe? Okay. All right. If you would like to learn more about the chain of transmission, how things worked out, how we ended up needing this all written out, and you'd like to know it from a good, authentic, and pre-modern, because modern makes things messy, pre-modern view, the Igeret of Rab Sharir Gaon, one of the Gaonim from more than 1,000 years ago, wrote a brilliant explanation of how this whole process worked from Sinai to the writing of the Mishnah and the writing of the Talmud in a way that sounds remarkably modern. It's not fundamentalist. It's not just stop asking questions. That's a really good question of how this whole process works. Let me explain to you how it worked, and let me show you why it's still very important and very valid and very authentic. There are other modern things as well. There's a wonderful book called Back to the Sources, which covers not just Mishnah, but all of the classical Jewish texts and how they were written, why they were written, and why they are written the way they are written. Okay, but let's go back to our question tonight. Now that we understand that we're going to encounter arguments from time to time, we have to sharpen our brains because we're not just reading the answer, we have to work for the answer.
So number 4, once it happened that his sons came home late from a wedding feast.
All right, pronoun game. Who's his?
Oh.
The Kohen.
What's that?
The Kohen Gadol.
The Kohen Gadol? Nope. Good guess, because we talked about him first.
Yeah.
Who was the last pronoun mentioned? Who was
Gamliel.
Gamliel? Okay. Rabban Gamliel had sons, and they came home late. One of the things we will see occasionally in Mishnah, you'll see it a lot more in the Talmud, is case study, right? Because it's one thing to make a statement. It's even better if you have an example of something that happened, because examples of something that happened are much more tangible and much less subject to interpretation. So we're going to get an example of what he meant. So Rabban Gamliel's sons come home late.
From a wedding feast, and they said to him, we have not yet recited the evening Shema.
It was that kind of party, right? They didn't really take time for the Mariv service.
He said to them, if it is not yet dawn, you are still obligated to recite.
All right, so when he said dawn, he meant dawn as the closure for the mitzvah, right? If you haven't done it yet and it's still not dawn, it doesn't matter that it's not your bedtime. It doesn't matter that it's not anyone's bedtime. It's still night, and therefore you still have the obligation and the opportunity to do the mitzvah. Make sense? Maybe? So by the example of his instructions to his own sons, we can get some meat on the bone here. However,
5, and not in respect to this alone did they so decide, but wherever the sages say until midnight, the mitzvah may be performed until dawn.
all right, magic of magic, and you will see this often as well. We just reconciled 2 opinions. All right, we started with 3 different opinions. We had Rabbi Eliezer saying it was the end of the first watch. We had the sages say midnight, and we had Rabban Gamliel say dawn. The last 2 have just been married. What'd they say? How do they reconcile the fact that the sages, which is the majority of the rabbis, say midnight, and Rabban Gamliel, who was a very important rabbi, but still just one guy, said dawn? How do they put those 2 together so they don't contradict each other?
There's a line between the 2.
Mm-hmm.
So it encompasses the entire time between midnight and dawn.
Okay, so it says we've got the midnight as a line, but dawn is also okay. So we have to figure out, why did the sages say midnight? So the sages said midnight, but they agreed that until dawn was also okay. And now we got to explain, why do they say midnight if dawn is also okay? Why not just say dawn? Right? It sounds like two different things, but what we've just said is that midnight is not a hard line. Midnight is their teaching, but dawn is also permissible. And now we've got to work out how we reconcile that. First, we get a couple examples of other things that follow this pattern.
A would be the burning of the fat and the pieces may be performed until dawn.
Right? This is the leftover things that were on the altar from the sacrifices. If they hadn't all been consumed during their sacrifice, they would have to be continually burnt until they became nothing but ash. And that process should be done by midnight, but if it's not, you can still do it until dawn. If you haven't done it by the end of dawn, then you failed in that obligation.
And item C, why then did the sages say?
Similarly.
Similarly.
B first, sorry.
Similarly, all the offerings that are to be eaten within one day may be eaten until dawn.
Right, where it says eat this within the same day, for example, the Passover sacrifice. When do we want to have our eating done on the Seder night? Midnight, right? We better be benching your Birkat HaMazon by midnight. You can still do more of the Seder, but the benching is midnight. But if for some reason you needed to go until dawn, this is back in the days of the real Passover sacrifice that was being eaten, as long as you were done before dawn, you hadn't failed. Okay? So why say this if dawn is also okay?
So why did the sages say until midnight? In order to keep a man far from transgression.
Okay, so explain this to me like a driving instructor.
In case you don't make it by midnight, you could do it till dawn, but they don't want you to transgress. So if you wait till dawn, you might wait till half an hour after dawn. Now you've not done it right. So they say midnight. So now if you're, one of the people who's always late with everything, you still won't have gone past dawn.
Right. So even in the ancient world, there was such a thing as Jewish Standard Time. And they know that if you say the class starts at 7, that people are going to come at 7:05 and so on. And so instead they said, do it by 6:30, knowing that some people would be a little late and that would be okay, right? It builds in a cushion. If you tell people when you should do it, when you are best and most likely to do it properly, then if they happen to run late, because the wedding feast was long, they can still do it in the last until the very, very hard line. And this was a big part of rabbinic teaching, was to say not just where is the line, but also what's my target line, right? This is the do or die. This is, if you go past dawn, you are off the bullseye. I mean, not just the bullseye, I mean the entire target, you have missed the target. This tells you where that bullseye ring is, right? As long as you are between the 3 stars and midnight, that's considered in the middle of the target. You've hit it nice, great. If you go till dawn, you're still in the target, but you're getting close to missing. So you probably want to adjust your aim so that you can consistently hit the middle and not accidentally let your arrow go fly off to the side. And the rabbis are going to give this teaching over and over again in many different ways, because they want to make sure not just that we know the hard line, but that we also know the target line so that we can guide our behavior better.
Did the sages come before Gamliel or?
Contemporaneous. So we're talking about the same group. The entire group of sages that we're talking about here are referred to as the Tanaim. And all the sages that are from the time of the restoration, from Ezra, although we really only get names from later in that period, until the writing of the Mishnah with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in around the year 250, all of them are considered to be of one category.
Even though they were hundreds of years.
Even though it was hundreds of years, they are considered of one category and of one caliber, and they can argue with each other. Rabbis that come later, for example, the rabbis of the Talmud, cannot contradict a rabbi from the earlier period. They can interpret, and they can work to reconcile and show that they're not contradicting somebody, even though it might have seemed like they were contradicting someone, but they can't flat out contradict an earlier sage. And then after the closing of the Talmud, later rabbis can't contradict the words of the Talmud, and so on and so forth.
Which, well, I mean, I'm just thinking because the sages said maybe they in their mind thought that was the end. When they said until midnight, they were taking permission, and that just became kind of
A retroactive application.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we wrestle with in the Mishnah, and one of the reasons why the Talmud got written, is precisely because there are many nuances to the phrasing, and therefore it demands, as we've just done, more debate. We've spent 20 minutes discussing what is essentially 4 or 5 sentences, and that's how the Talmud eventually grows, trying to explain. This whole discussion in the Talmud takes like 2 pages, and 2 pages in the Talmud is a considerable amount of material. And even then, we get the answer straight up, but they go through all of the work of explaining why the answers are what they are, and how the different sages agreed or didn't agree. Make sense? Maybe? Okay, let's do some more. Yes? Oh.
If you want a permanently believing Jew,
Mm-hmm.
you generally would like to start them when they're a child.
Yes.
It's easier to implant things as a child than it is to somebody who's beyond senior age.
As the Mishnah says, teaching a child is like writing on clean paper. Teaching an adult is like writing on paper that's been erased.
So if the Torah says, recite them when you lie down and when you get up.
Right.
If you were telling a child that, you would say, make sure that you remember God
Mm-hmm.
before you go to sleep. Remember God when you get up to go to work. Remember God then.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody really
Need to know the
get
nuances?
exercise over because the fat burning took past midnight, that it's still okay to say that?
Yes.
Am I being cynical, or is this somebody? These people that I have this, the Supreme Court judges with whom I've had dinner,
Mm-hmm.
my professors with whom I've had dinner, I've had these same arguments with them. Why are you exercising? Why don't you say what you mean?
So,
What God said, God wrote the Torah. He says, remember me before you go to sleep, and remember me first thing when you get up.
okay.
That's
So
what he said.
you need to study Mishnah, or at least be exposed to its teachings, which many people have without having opened the Mishnah, because their rabbis or their school teachers have shared the teachings without attribution, without saying this is from the Mishnah, that gets imprinted within the style of Jewish observance. But studying it is very important for 2 reasons. One, you can't always expect everything to go normally, right? Like Rabban Gamliel's sons. They came home extremely late enough that their father was probably awake to get ready for the new day. Right? That's how late they came home, which is why he had to ask them, is it dawn yet? Because it might have been. That's how close to coming home at dawn they were. In that situation, you need to know what to do, because they probably weren't going to go to bed right then, or they might have been ready to go to bed, but it was going to be morning very, very soon. So they weren't sure if they'd missed their window. And they needed to
lie down at all.
Well, they might have, or they might not have. It depends. Some people, you stay out all night, you still have to go to work in the morning, or else you're going to get fired.
So do they have to say
So whether or not they have to lie down or not is going to be a question in a later Mishnah. But whether the window is still open was just settled. That the window was still open even in that special circumstance. So knowing the law in more detail helps you navigate the special circumstances. Knowing the law in more detail also prevents, and this is one reason why Jews have believed that everyone should study to the best of their capability. Knowing the law is also our best defense against someone either changing the law, or someone altering its interpretation so substantially that they can lead us either to transgressions or to more oppressive lifestyles than are advisable. Right? If you know the law and someone tells you you've got to do it between 7:30 p.m. and 7:45 p.m., you know they're not telling you what God taught us. That may be their interpretation, and they may think they're doing the same thing the sages were doing, which is putting a protective layer to make sure we don't miss, so by narrowing it down to 15 minutes. But what happens if you don't know that you really actually have all the way till dawn, and you're the poor schlemiel who's working that graveyard shift? And between 7:15 and 7:45, you don't have a coffee break. When are you supposed to be saying the Shema then? Right? Someone has just now legislated by their own interpretation of the law you out of fulfilling Torah if you don't know the law yourself. And so studying it ourselves and knowing its permutations and applications, even though it may seem a little esoteric, and even though the normal life doesn't require this level of detail and understanding, is an important inoculation and an important boost for our understanding of Torah. Because ultimately that's what it comes down to. Right? Just as our Supreme Court justices, we hope, in addition to other legislators and judges, take every word of the Constitution seriously and believe that their job is to really apply it. We take the Word of God so seriously that we don't want to know just how the normal things work. We want to know how all of it works, even in the most bizarre of circumstances. And trust me, in the Mishnah, and even more so in the Talmud, we get into some bizarre circumstances. Because if God wants us to understand his world according to God's word, we've got to do the math. We've got to do the permutations. We can't just rely on a simplistic telling of do it this way and don't ask why. Okay, let's do Mishnah 2 and we'll get the next point. So, anyone here want to predict? We've just asked what time we say the Shema in the evening. You will lie down, and when you rise up, so guess what our next Mishnah is about? The Shema in the morning. Eric, if you will.
From what time may one recite the Shema in the morning? 1, from the time that one can distinguish between blue and white. And of course, Rabbi Eliezer says between blue and green.
Okay. Ma, what's the difference?
Actually, it has to be more light to distinguish between blue and green. Blue and white would be more obvious even if there was less light.
Okay, exactly right. So Rabbi Eliezer, again, just like on the last Mishnah, is giving a narrower, or giving an earlier beginning, right? So he is saying between blue and white, as long as you can tell the difference between blue and white, you're okay. And that means it's now light enough. This is pre-dawn, right? For those of you that are ever awake at that time when the sun is coming up, you can tell the difference between a colored object and an uncolored object pretty early before the sun has actually gone over the horizon. Right? The sun does not need to be in the sky for you to tell the difference between black and white, right? And essentially blue in this case is that. Now, where would this blue be coming from? I mean, what, people have a blue index card to sit there?
I think it's
Techelet, exactly right? The techelet. Everybody in these days would have been wearing their talit, and their talit would have had fringes, and the fringes would have had, lo and behold, white threads and one blue thread, right? The techelet thread. So all you have to do is look down at your talit, and if you can tell the difference of which one is the blue thread and which one are the white threads, according to Rabbi Eliezer, good to go. Do the Shema and you're doing your duty. On the other hand, blue and green, some of us have trouble even in broad daylight, but blue and green are much more similar colors in general. I mean, they are very close on the spectrum, all right? And they are also colors that have the right shade. You need light to be able to tell the difference between them. So this is a later period of time. Right? Now, why would anyone, what's that?
Where did they get the green from?
Where do they get the green? Well, everything growing around them is green.
Oh, okay.
So thankfully, they lived in an agrarian society. Green was a common color. But why, I want to sleep in. Who cares what time I can start? Right? Why would this be important to someone? Think ancient world. Think farmers.
Yeah, they have to go out.
They got work to do, people, and they do not have lamps to help them at night. So any work you need to do, you have to do when there is light shining on the face of the earth, which means as soon as it's light enough, you do your prayers and you get out there to work. And so earlier could be more convenient. But if earlier is too early, it's, still really night, then you didn't say the Shema in the right window. And so they got to know when this early window opens up. And of course, we have to deal with the opposite side.
And he must finish it by sunrise.
Right? That's one opinion.
Good.
Right? So that we have this pre-dawn light, and then I'm running out of room down here. The sun comes up over the horizon, or
Rabbi Joshua says, until the third hour of the day, for such is the custom of the children of kings, to rise at the third hour.
Right? Not everybody's a farmer. Some of us are, shall we say, pampered, at least in the eyes of the ancient world. And they were not waking up at pre-dawn light. The rooster did nothing for them. They could just execute the rooster if it was bothering them. And yet, they're still rising. And that means it is still, to do our parallel here, right? We want day, and we want rising time. Right? We had bedtime, now we have rising time. And they want to know, when does day begin, and when does the rising time, the reasonable time to be rising, conclude? That's our window. And the average person, non-princes, they were up by dawn. They better be, or else they're not going to be able to get their work done. Princes, on the other hand, were a bit later, and Rabbi Joshua is saying, we're not going to say that rising time is done, because we know there are categories of people who are rising later than dawn, God bless them, and we can't write them out of the mitzvah. We can't just say, well, I guess they never get to do the mitzvah, because that must still be rising.
How can you apply it today with somebody who would work at starting by 4 o'clock in the morning? They have to go to work.
So the hours remain the same, regardless of our personal schedule. So we say the evening prayer service and the evening Shema in the evening window that's been worked out, and we say the morning prayer service and the morning Shema in the morning window, whether or not we woke up very, very early or whether we woke up very, very late. So if you wake up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and you went to bed before dawn, you missed your window for saying the morning Shema. And that's just simply a facet of life. Now, if you could have woken up or stayed awake, if you were coming home late for work or a wedding party, and you could say your morning prayer right before you go to bed at, say, 7 a.m., that would be okay. So even though you'd be going to sleep, you'd still say the Shacharit service, then you go to bed, and then you wake up for your graveyard shift. You say your Mariv service, your evening service, and go on with your life. So the times become fixed rather than just independent personal, because as we pointed out before, this is essential for establishing community. Otherwise, everyone's just doing it in their own way, and that may be uncomfortable and inconvenient for some individuals, but the community has to be bound together by sharing times and sharing this flow. By the way, you can download apps which will do all this math for you, because when we say the third hour of the day, we mean the third hour of the daylight time having been divided into 12 equal sections. So yes, on the equinox, that's going to be 3 hours after sunrise. But for the rest of the year, it's going to be longer than 60 minutes or less than 60 minutes, depending upon the length of daylight. And in the old days, you would have a sundial that was a relative sundial, and it would show you where you were on the day hour, depending upon the season. Nowadays, it's much easier to download it for your phone. You can also get it online, but it's you can get alerts that say it's now 1 hour of daylight, 2 hours of daylight, 3 hours, and make sure that you're on schedule according to rabbinic time. Yes, good.
Most calendars, Jewish calendars, they tell you each day what time is the next Hama and all this.
If you get a good detailed one, yes.
Yeah.
Not all of them have it that detailed, and some of them it might depend upon where you live. New York, it's easy to find all those times. If you live in Idaho, it's harder to find them. So it's quite good that we're now living in a time when you can carry it in your pocket. It's better than a sundial on your wrist.
2B is pretty reasonable.
2B is pretty reasonable, which says,
If one recites the Shema later, he loses nothing, like one who reads in the Torah.
okay, loses nothing? What does that mean? You're right. You recite the Shema at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
If you get up at 2.
You get up at 2. You recite the Shema. Have you done something wrong? No. Have you done the mitzvah of reciting the Shema in the morning?
It doesn't say in the morning. It says when he rises up.
Exactly. Well, so this is the interpretation is rising up is the time of rising, not your individual rising.
No,
So I can see we're having a difference of opinion on how the oral law was put together, right? So, and that, by the way, is one of the confrontations that eventually led to what we call the Karaite Schism. Right? There were a group of Jews in the 800, 900, 8th, 9th century of the Common Era that said, you know what, this whole Mishnah stuff, the rabbinic interpretation, the oral law, all of this tradition and explanation, it's not in here, therefore it doesn't count. And they threw it out the window. And they went for what they considered to be a truer to the literal text interpretation. And it was kind of like our early Reformation. In parallel to the Protestant Reformation that later happened to Christianity. You know, all you have to do is open your Bible and you know what God wants of you. And within 2 generations, they had their own commentary and their own law codes because it doesn't work like that. You don't remain a community without sharing interpretation and application. And they quickly discovered that in their own way. It's a shame that they split. Eventually, they almost completely have faded. There are still a few very, very small Karaite communities. There is also a neo-Karaite movement, which we can talk about some other time. But yes, the oral law became one of the linchpins of making sure that communities and Jews all over the world interpreted this within a spectrum of acceptable interpretations. And without it, we would never have remained cohesive given how spread out and diverse our people became. Okay, so what this last 2b is saying is you can still read the Shema any time of the day, but it's just like you're reading from the Torah for study. You don't get mitzvah points for doing it, right? You're not considered of having fulfilled the mitzvah of reciting the Shema in the morning. You can read anytime. That's just called reading, not recitation. It's not a formal fulfillment of the commandment. It's just reading. And you should read anytime. But it doesn't have the same significance. Now, we see this in a similar way in other parts of our liturgy. If you are here at 9:30 in the morning on a Saturday, and you are following the service all the way through until we finish around 12, you're going to say the words of the Shema many, many times. Right? We say it in the preliminary service, we say it in the Shacharit service, we say it in the Kedusha later for Musa. But the Shacharit one is the main one. That is we're doing the mitzvah now one. And by the way, we're relying on that 3-hour buffer, or else we'd have to be doing that before dawn or at sunrise. But the one in the preliminary and the one in the Musa, we're just reciting it, which is why you don't need to close your eyes. You don't need the same level of concentration and a focus that you do for the Shacharit one. It's okay. They're slamming each other against the walls in the room next door.
But we're not actually doing it within the 3rd hour, are
we for Shacharit, yes.
we?
Yes. I mean, unless it's very, very early. I'm trying to think of even in the latest summer, in the height of summer, of whether we're ever over. I don't think we are ever quite over, but we can look up the astronomy of that, of where the sun is. But we should be fine because the Shema comes very early in the Shacharit service. Okay. Let's see, we got 5 minutes. Yeah, I think we can do just about cover Mishnah 3. Let's go for it.
Okay, Beit Shammai said, in the evening, every man should recline and recite the Shema, And in the morning, you should stand, as it says, when you lie down and when you get up.
All right, so Beit Shammai, as is kind of their normal pattern. Beit Shammai was one of the great academies of the ancient world. It followed the teachings of Shammai, the Shammai. It's the house of Shammai. It means it's the school of Shammai. And their interpretation of when you lie down and when you get up is when you're saying the Shema in the morning, get down. Lie down.
No,
And-
in the evening.
Sorry, in the evening. Thank you. When you're saying the Shema in the evening, you better be lying down. Because if you're not lying down, you're not doing it properly. And when you say the Shema in the morning, you better be up. Because if you're not up, you're not doing it properly. And Beit Hillel gives a counter argument.
Beit Hillel says that every man should recite it in his own way, as it says, when you walk by the way. Why then is it said, and when you lie down and when you get up? At the time when people lie down and at the time when people rise up.
Okay, so Beit Hillel has to explain it in a different way. And they say, no. Look at the rest of the verse, right? The rest of the verse says, when you walk by the way. So if you're reciting it when you walk by the way, does that mean I have to walk around while reciting it? Do I have to scoot around while lying down because I'm going on the way? Does this mean I have to do it outside? They say, no, this means that each person can do it as they see fit, right? If you want to say the Shema when you're lying down in the evening, say it when you're lying down. If you can concentrate better while sitting, say it while sitting. And the same thing in the morning. If you want to say the Shema first thing, even while still lying down, a few other things have taken place, which we'll get to another time, okay. But if sitting is better for your concentration, by all means sit. But then, well, hold on. But then they have to explain what the lying down and rising up means. So this is a very important part of Jewish law. When two people are arguing about a verse and how to interpret it, and one person says, I interpret it to mean this, and someone else says, well, I have a different verse that I use to come to my conclusion on this topic, they will almost always have to go back and explain how they do interpret the first person's verse that was used. Because if you're not using it the way they're using it, how are you using it? Right? They used it to prove this. You're using something else to prove it or to prove something different on the same topic. What do you do with the leftover part? Because every verse matters. Right? That was one of our basic assumptions. God didn't waste paper and pen when he was writing Torah. So if every verse matters and you don't read it to mean what Shammai read it to mean, what do you read it to mean? And so they say, we use the lying down and rising up to mean the time that this is happening, not the posture, right? We're not reading this as your literal posture. We're reading this as our markers for time, which goes back and fits very nicely with the discussion we had for our first two Mishnayot. Make sense? Okay.
Rabbi Tarfon said, I was once walking by the way, and I reclined to recite the Shema according to the words of Beit Shammai, and I incurred danger from robbers.
Okay, remember we said case studies help us a lot? So Rabbi Tarfon is saying, one time I was out and, riding my donkey or walking in the way, and I laid down to say the evening Shema, and I almost got mugged. Laying down, it's kind of a vulnerable position. So therefore, you shouldn't lay down, right? Because when I did it, it almost got me in trouble. That's proof that it's not the necessary way to do it. It's not, remember Rabbi Hillel said that you can do it in your own way, but Rabbi Tarfon is saying you shouldn't think you have to lay down because you might end up in trouble in many situations, especially if you're riding a donkey, trying to lay down on the donkey. Not a good idea.
And they said to him, you deserve to come to harm because you acted against the words of Beit Hillel.
All right. This is going to be our final note. One of the great things about the Mishnah, and indeed any of the classical Jewish texts, is it assumes you are brilliant. Right? It's one of the most empowering things. It's like having a teacher who's talking to you who assumes you've already read every textbook on the subject, and you're just going to discuss it now. The Mishnah assumes that apart from the thing it's telling you in this particular sentence, you have read every other Mishnah that there is, that you must just be reviewing this. Because we know from other very important rabbinic texts that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai had a very long-standing rivalry going, and Beit Hillel is eventually vindicated. It is ratified by a voice from heaven, and it is ratified in many other ways as well, as being the definitive voice of the direction Judaism takes. And so for Rabbi Tarfon, who is later than this position, to follow or teaching of Beit Shammai, he's basically saying, I was trying to follow the minority opinion, and that's basically a bad idea. See, you almost got mugged. Because what are you doing not following Beit Hillel? Everyone knows Beit Hillel has won, and Beit Hillel is the force that is the academy that we now follow. We didn't erase Beit Shammai from the history books. Very important, right? We always keep the record of the debate, discussion, and resolution, and we don't go back and edit the people who lost out, but they did lose on almost all topics. There's a few places where Shammai wins, but that means you still stick with the majority decision. Like I said, you would know that if you've read every other book, which the Mishnah assumes you have. Okay, any questions for Mishnah, these three Mishnayot, or what it is we're doing in this class? Okay, all right. Same time next week, we will press on. Mishnah Berachot, as you can see from the handout, is going to go into more topics that might be a little familiar from our prayer service, and then we'll later get into things that are maybe a little less familiar, and there should be lots of good tangents and side discussions on all of this. So read up, bring your questions, bring your minds, and we will have good discussions week after week. Take care and have a good night. And it's not quite time yet to say the Shema. Now, if it was winter, it would be. Come on, computer.